The metal chair groaned under General Korthvel's weight as he shifted again, his massive frame clearly uncomfortable in the human-sized furniture. The interview room on Station Alpha 7 was neutral territory, but everything about it screamed. Human design, too small, too bright, to clean for a warrior who had spent decades in the blood-soaked trenches of galactic warfare. The interviewer, a young Zeltharian journalist named Shiksada, watched nervously as the legendary Vrextai general flexed his razor-sharp claws. Each talon was longer than her finger, capable of tearing through reinforced armor plating. The scars crisscrossing his reptilian hide told stories of 1,000 battles. But the deepest ones, the ones that really mattered, were invisible to the naked eye. "General, thank you for agreeing to this interview," Shiksara began, her voice steady, despite the predator sitting across from her. "The galactic community has been waiting to hear your side of the human wars. Many still can't believe how quickly the Vrextai Empire withdrew from human space." Korthvel's yellow eyes fixed on her with the intensity of a targeting system. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding stone. "Withdrew? Is that what they're calling it now?" A sound that might have been laughter rumbled from his throat. "We didn't withdraw, little one. We ran. We ran like frightened children from the darkness." The recording device between them pulsed with a soft blue light, capturing every word for posterity. Outside the station's viewport, the stars seemed to watch silently, holding their breath for the tale that was about to unfold. "Tell me about your first encounter with them," Shiksara pressed, her journalistic instincts overriding her survival reflexes. Korthvel's massive head tilted back, and for a moment his eyes grew distant, lost in memories that still haunted his dreams.
"Ah."
The first encounter. "You want to know about the moment we discovered that nightmares could take physical form and pilot starships?" He stood abruptly, his 7-foot frame casting a shadow across the small room. Walking to the viewport, he stared out at the cosmic void, his reflection ghost-like in the reinforced glass. "We called them the soft ones back then," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets. "Our intelligence reports were laughably inadequate. They showed us a species that had barely crawled out of their home system, still using primitive chemical rockets to push their tin cans through space. The Galactic Council's xenobiologists classified them as Class C sentients, barely above the threshold for sapience." His claws scraped against the metal wall as his hands clenched into fists. The High Command was already planning victory parades. Another backwater species to be absorbed into the Empire. Their resources divided among the worthy, their people relocated to labor camps on the rim worlds. Standard procedure executed 10,000 times across the galaxy. Shiksara's recording device captured the change in his voice from professional detachment to something approaching awe. "But you were wrong." "Wrong?" Korthvel spun around, his eyes blazing with an emotion she couldn't identify. "Wrong doesn't begin to describe it. We weren't just wrong. We were blind, deaf, and stupid. We looked at humanity and saw weakness, where there was strength hidden beneath the surface, waiting to explode like a neutron star going supernova." He began pacing now, his movements predatory and restless. "The war officially began when their colony ships crossed into Vrexai space. Standard protocol demanded we intercept them, inform them of their trespass, and offer them the choice: immediate surrender and relocation, or destruction. Simple, clean, efficient. We'd done it 1,000,000 times before." The general's laugh was bitter as old poison. "I was commanding the patrol squadron that day. 5 heavy cruisers, each one carrying enough firepower to glass a small moon. We were expecting maybe a few hundred refugees and some converted cargo haulers, desperate enough to risk everything for a new home." He stopped pacing and faced the interviewer directly. "What we found was a convoy of 30 ships, led by a vessel that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. The Inchin's Pride, a civilian transport converted for deep space colonization. It was beautiful in its own primitive way. Sleek white hull decorated with strange symbols that we later learned represented their concept of hope." Korthvel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When we hailed them with our standard surrender demand, expecting the usual pleading and negotiation, their captain came on screen.
Oh.
A human named Taman. Young by their standards, maybe 40% of their years. He had these eyes, you understand? Eyes that had seen too much, carried too much weight. The kind of eyes you only get from losing everything once and refusing to let it happen again. The general's massive frame shuddered slightly. He looked directly at me through the communication link, studied my face for a long moment, then did something that no rational being in the galaxy would do. He smiled. Not the submissive grimace of a defeated enemy, not the nervous twitch of someone buying time. A real smile, full of teeth and terrible promise. Chixara found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the tale. "What did he say?" said General. "With all due respect, we've come too far to turn back now. These people behind me, they've lost their homes, their families, everything they ever loved. This ship and the others in our convoy, they're not just carrying colonists, they're carrying the last hope of a dying world." Then he paused, and that smile got wider. "If you want to stop us, you're going to have to go through us. All of us." Korthful returned to his chair, but instead of sitting, he gripped the back of it with enough force to leave permanent indentations in the metal. I gave him one last chance, told him his civilian transport was no match for a Vrexty battle cruiser, that his people would die for nothing. You know what he said? The interviewer shook her head, transfixed. He said, "General, you don't understand humans very well yet. We don't die for nothing. We die to make sure the ones who come after us never have to." Then he cut the communication. Link, the silence in the room was deafening. Even the space station's ambient hum seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "What happened next changed everything," Korthfell continued, his voice now carrying the cadence of a funeral dirge. "Captain Tommen ordered his ship to full acceleration, pointing directly at my flagship, a civilian transport, carrying families. And children, old people, and pregnant mothers turned itself into a guided missile aimed at the heart of my battle group." His yellow eyes met Chixara's, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone, not just respect for a fallen enemy, but fear. Deep, primal fear that still lived in the depths of a warrior's soul. The Ancient's pride hit us at nearly 20% of light speed. The explosion lit up sensors across 3 star systems. My flagship, the Dominion's Wrath, pride of the Vrexti fleet, was crippled instantly. 300 of my finest soldiers died in that single moment, along with every soul aboard that human transport. The general finally sat down, his massive frame seeming to collapse inward on itself. That little ship, that insignificant collection of metal and dreams, taught me something that all our intelligence reports had missed. Humans don't just fight for territory or resources or political ideology. They fight for something infinitely more dangerous. They fight for each other. And when you threaten what they love, they don't just become soldiers, become living weapons, willing to sacrifice everything to protect what matters most. He looked up at the interviewer one final time, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. That's when I knew we weren't fighting a normal species. That's when I realized we had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen. Before a race that could turn love itself into a weapon of war. The silence in the interview room stretched like a taut wire before Korthfell's voice cut through it like a plasma blade. His massive frame moved restlessly as memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface. 3 months after the Ancient's Pride incident, High Command decided we needed a decisive victory, he began, his yellow eyes reflecting the starlight streaming through the viewport. They chose New Busan, a human mining colony on the edge of their territory. Perfect target, they said. Isolated, lightly defended, strategically worthless enough that humans wouldn't waste resources protecting it. Chixara watched as the general's scarred hands clenched and unclenched, a nervous habit she'd noticed whenever he talked about specific battles. The intelligence reports made it sound like a training exercise. One small world, population maybe, 200,000, mostly miners and their families. A few orbital defense platforms that our ships could sweep aside like space dust. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the metal floor with a sound like claws on stone. Moving to the viewport, he pressed his massive palm against the reinforced glass, leaving foggy prints from his body heat. We sent the 9th Assault Legion, 50,000 of our finest shock troops. Veterans who had conquered a dozen worlds, backed by atmospheric fighters, heavy artillery, and enough firepower to reduce continents to rubble. I commanded the operation, personally expecting to be back in orbit within 72 hours with a complete victory report. The general's reflection in the glass looked like a ghost haunted by its own past. The colony's military commander was a human female named Colonel HFY. Our intelligence files on her were almost empty. Career administrator spent most of her service time managing supply depots and training facilities. No combat experience, no strategic victories, no reason for concern. Turned back to Ward, the interviewer, and she saw something flicker across his reptilian features, an expression that might have been respect mixed with terror. What our intelligence didn't tell us was that Colonel HFY had grown up on New Busan. She knew every tunnel and every mine, and every building and every settlement, every path through the wilderness. She didn't just command the defense of that world, she was part of it, connected to it like a nerve system. Korthvel began pacing again, his movements more agitated now. When our dropships entered the atmosphere, everything looked normal. The colony's few military installations had been abandoned, their defensive positions empty. We landed in the main settlement without a single shot being fired. My officers were already joking about the quickest conquest in Vrextai history. His voice dropped to a growl that made the interview room's air recycling system seem loud. That's when we discovered what humans call asymmetric warfare. The entire planet had been turned into one massive trap, and we had walked right into it. The general stopped pacing and gripped the back of his chair with enough force to bend the metal. The first sign something was wrong came when my advanced scouts reported that the mining equipment was missing. Massive industrial excavators or processors, drilling rigs, all gone. We assumed the humans had evacuated their valuable machinery to prevent us from seizing it. His laugh was like grinding stone. We were half right. They had moved the equipment, but not to safety. They had converted every piece of mining gear into weapons of war. Those excavators. They'd been fitted with armor plating and military-grade weapon systems, turned into mobile fortresses that could appear from underground tunnels without warning. Chixara found herself taking notes frantically, trying to capture every detail of the most famous battle of the human wars. How many defenders did they actually have? That's the thing, Korthvel replied, his eyes blazing with remembered frustration. We never got an accurate count. Colonel HFY had organized the entire civilian population into her defense network. Miners became sappers, using their knowledge of explosives to turn every street corner into a potential ambush point. Factory workers became weapons technicians, jury-rigging industrial tools into instruments of death. Even the children were part of the plan, not as soldiers, but as intelligence gatherers, moving through ventilation systems and maintenance tunnels to report our positions. The general walked to the wall and activated a holographic display, showing a three-dimensional map of New Busan's main settlement. Look at this place. Every building connected by underground passages. Every street designed to funnel attackers into kill zones. Every structure built to provide overlapping fields. A fire? We thought we were conquering a mining town. We were actually assaulting a fortress that had been decades in the making. The hologram shifted, showing the complex network of tunnels beneath the colony. But the real genius was in how they used the terrain. New Busan was a mining world riddled with shafts, caverns, and excavated areas that went down 4 kilometers. The humans had spent years connecting these tunnels, creating a three-dimensional battlefield where they could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and disappear back into the depths. Korthvel manipulated the display, highlighting specific areas. The first major engagement happened here, at the Central Processing Facility. My 3rd Battalion moved in to secure what looked like an abandoned industrial complex. The moment they entered the main building, explosions erupted from every direction. Not random bombing, precisely placed charges that brought down specific sections while leaving others intact, creating a maze of rubble and twisted metal. His voice grew quieter, more thoughtful. What happened next still gives me nightmares. As my soldiers tried to navigate the debris, human defenders emerged from hidden positions, not just soldiers, but workers wearing mining suits modified with armor plating. They moved through that wreckage like they belonged there, using industrial tools as weapons with devastating effectiveness. The display showed tactical symbols moving through the facility. A human worker named Jin Woo led the defense of that sector. He was just a maintenance engineer, but he knew every pipe, every cable, every structural weakness in that building. He turned the facility's own systems against us, venting toxic gases into areas where my troops had taken cover, overloading power conduits to create electrical traps, even using the facilities or processing equipment to rain molten metal on our positions. Korthval's claws scraped against the holographic controls. Jinwoo and his team held that position for 18 hours against overwhelming odds. When we finally overran their defenses, we found that they had rigged the entire facility to collapse. Ginwoo activated the charges manually, bringing down the whole structure rather than let us capture it intact. The general deactivated the display and turned back to face the interviewer. That's when I began to understand what we were really fighting. These weren't professional soldiers following orders, they were people defending their homes, their families, their entire way of life. Every one of them was willing to die to make our victory as costly as possible. He returned to his chair, settling his massive frame with the weariness of someone carrying the weight of impossible memories. The siege lasted for months. 4 months of urban warfare unlike anything in galactic history. The humans had no air support, no orbital weapons, no reinforcements coming. But they had something more valuable. They had turned their entire world into a weapon. Korthvel's voice took on an almost admiring tone. Colonel Haewon coordinated the defense from hidden command centers deep in the mine shafts. She used the colony's communication networks to stay in contact with every cell, every group of defenders. When we cut the main communication lines, they switched to mining equipment radios. When we jammed those, they used light signals reflected off the cavern walls. The general's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile. But the moment that truly changed everything came during the final assault. We had finally located one of Haewon's command centers, and were moving to capture it with our best assault troops. As my soldiers breached the facility, they found something that stopped them cold. He paused, his yellow eyes growing distant. It was a classroom. An underground school where the colony's children had been sheltering during the siege. The desks were still arranged in neat rows, children's drawings still hanging on the walls. But it had been converted into a command center. With tactical displays and communication equipment scattered among the school supplies, Korthvel's voice grew very quiet. Colonel Haewon was there, along with a dozen civilians, teachers, parents, grandparents. They'd been coordinating the entire defense from a place where children learned about hope and futures. When my troops surrounded them, Haewon stood up and did something that haunts me to this day. The interview room felt smaller suddenly, as if the weight of the story was pressing in on them from all sides.
Thanked my soldiers for being honorable warriors.
Then activated a device that sent a signal throughout the colony's network. Every remaining defense position, every hidden weapons cache, every booby trap that hadn't been triggered yet, all of it activated simultaneously. The general's massive frame shuddered slightly. The explosions could be seen from orbit. The humans had turned their entire world into one final weapon, and they used it to deny us the victory we thought we had won. Colonel Haewon and her people died in that underground school, but they took half my remaining forces with them and left. New Busan, uninhabitable for months. He stood one final time, walking back to the viewport to stare out at the stars. That's when I truly understood what humans were capable of. They don't just fight battles, they transform everything around them into instruments of war. Every tool becomes a weapon. Every building becomes a fortress. Every person becomes a soldier willing to die for something greater than themselves. Korthvel's reflection in the glass looked older now, marked by the weight of hard-won wisdom. We held New Busan for 6 months after that, but it was meaningless. The humans had already won something more valuable than territory they had. Proven that no force in the galaxy could break their will to resist. The air in the interview room seemed to grow thicker as General Korthvel's massive frame settled back into his chair, the metal groaning under his weight. His yellow eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he was seeing through the walls of the station into memories that refused to fade. By the third month of the New Busan siege, we thought we had broken their spirit. He began, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets. Our forces controlled most of the surface settlements. The orbital platforms were ours, and we had cut off all supply lines to the resistance fighters hiding in the mine shafts. Chixara noticed how the general's claws kept scraping against the armrests of his chair, leaving deep gouges in the metal. It was a nervous habit that seemed to intensify whenever he talked about specific humans he had encountered during the war. But the attacks kept coming, Korthfell continued, his scarred face twisting with remembered frustration. Every night our supply convoys would disappear. Guard posts would be found empty in the morning with no sign of struggle, no bodies, just gone. Our soldiers started calling it ghost warfare, being hunted by shadows that struck without warning and vanished back into the darkness. The general stood and began his restless pacing again, his massive footsteps echoing in the small room. Our intelligence teams worked around the clock to identify who was coordinating these attacks. The resistance cells were too well organized, too precisely timed to be random. Someone was pulling the strings, turning scattered groups of miners and colonists into an efficient fighting force. He stopped at the viewport, pressing his palm against the reinforced glass as he stared out at the stars. It took us weeks to realize that the coordination was coming from inside the mine networks themselves. Someone had turned the entire underground tunnel system into a command and control center, using the colony's own communication infrastructure against us. Korthfell's reflection in the glass looked haunted. The breakthrough came when we captured a wounded resistance fighter, a young human named Kyun Soo, who had been injured in a sabotage operation. Under interrogation, he revealed something that changed our entire understanding of the enemy we were fighting. The general turned back toward the interviewer, his eyes blazing with a mixture of respect and fear. The resistance wasn't being led by a military officer or a political leader. It was being coordinated by an engineer, a civilian named Minho, would design most of the colony's infrastructure systems. He knew every tunnel, every power conduit, every water line on the entire planet. Chixara leaned forward, her recording device capturing every word. How did one civilian manage to coordinate such an effective resistance? That's what made him so dangerous, Korthfell replied, settling back into his chair with the wariness of someone carrying impossible memories. Minho wasn't just fighting us with weapons, he was fighting us with knowledge. He had turned his own creation, the colony's infrastructure, into a weapon system more sophisticated than anything in our military arsenals. The general activated the holographic display again, showing the complex network of tunnels beneath New Busan. Look at this maze. To us, it was just mining infrastructure, boring holes in the ground to extract but to Minho, it was a three-dimensional battlefield where he held every advantage. The display shifted, showing how the tunnels connected to power stations, water treatment facilities, and communication hubs throughout the colony. He had spent 15 years designing and building these systems. He knew exactly which power line to cut to disable our sensors, which water main to flood to block our advanced routes, which communication relay to sabotage to blind our coordination efforts. Korthfell manipulated the hologram, highlighting specific locations. But Minho's real genius was in how he used the mining equipment. Those massive excavation machines weren't just industrial tools in his hands. They became mobile weapons platforms that could tunnel through solid rock to appear behind our lines without warning. The general's voice took on an almost admiring tone. Our first major encounter with his tactics happened here at the Sector 7 processing plant. We had set up a forward command post in what looked like a secure location surrounded by open ground, with clear sight lines in all directions. Perfect defensive position by any conventional military standard. The holographic display showed the layout of the facility, with Vrexdai defensive positions marked in red. Minho's response was to ignore conventional tactics entirely. Instead of attacking the facility directly, he used mining charges to alter the underground water table, flooding the lower levels and forcing us to abandon our heavy equipment. Korthfel's scarred face grew more animated as he relived the tactical challenge. But that was just the opening move. While we were dealing with the flooding, his teams used maintenance tunnels to place explosive charges throughout the facility's support structures. Not random bombing, precisely calculated demolitions that would bring down specific sections while leaving others intact. The display showed the facility's collapse pattern, a carefully orchestrated destruction that created a maze of rubble and twisted metal. And the charges detonated, our defensive positions became death traps. But Minho had planned for that too. His people emerged from hidden positions in the wreckage, using the chaos to strike at our command elements before disappearing back into the underground network. The general deactivated the display and stood again, his movements more agitated. Now, it took us 6 weeks to track down his primary command center. 6 weeks of playing cat and mouse with a civilian engineer, was outmaneuvering our best military, strategists using nothing but industrial equipment and intimate knowledge of his own world. Korthfel walked to the far wall, where a small viewport offered a view of the space station's docking bay. The final hunt began when we intercepted one of his communication bursts. Our cryptographers managed to trace the signal to a section of the mine network that had been marked as unstable and abandoned. Perfect hiding place. Who would think to look for a command center in tunnels that were supposedly ready to collapse? Voice grew quieter, more introspective. Led the assault team personally. 50 of our best combat specialists, equipped with the finest weapons and armor the Empire could provide. We descended into those tunnels, expecting to find a desperate man hiding in the darkness. What we found was something far more dangerous. The general's massive frame seemed to shrink slightly, as if the memory itself was pressing down on him. Minho had turned that abandoned section into a fortress. Every tunnel approach was monitored. Every intersection was a potential ambush point. Every chamber was rigged with explosives that could be triggered remotely. He wasn't just hiding down there, he was hunting us. Korthfel returned to his chair, settling his weight with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the scars of too many battles. The final confrontation happened in what had once been the mine's central control room. We had fought our way through a maze of booby traps and automated defenses, losing half our team in the process. When we finally breached the command center, we found Minho sitting calmly at a bank of monitoring equipment, watching our approach on security cameras. The general's yellow eyes grew distant, lost in the memory of that moment. He was younger than I had expected, maybe 35 by human standards, wearing the simple coveralls of a mining engineer. But his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, sacrificed too much for his people's survival. Chixara found herself holding her breath, completely absorbed in the tale. "What did he say when you captured him?" "That's the thing," Korthfel replied, his voice carrying a mixture of wonder and terror. "I expected him to beg for mercy, too. Try to negotiate for the lives of his remaining fighters, to offer some kind of bargain that might save his people. Instead, he looked directly at me and smiled. That terrifying human smile that doesn't reach their eyes, the kind of expression that promises terrible things." The general's massive hands clenched into fists, his claws scraping against his palms. "Now he said something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. General Korthfel, you've made one fundamental mistake in this entire campaign, you assumed. We were fighting to win this battle, to drive you off our world, to achieve some kind of conventional military victory. We're not. We're fighting to teach you something far more valuable, that conquering humanity is impossible." The silence in the interview room was deafening. Even the space station's ambient systems seemed to have quieted, as if the universe itself was listening to the story of a moment that changed galactic history. I told him that his resistance was over, that his people had fought bravely, but it was time to surrender and save what lives remained, Korthfel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Minho just kept smiling that terrible smile and activated something he had been holding in his hand, a small device that looked like nothing more than a standard mining communicator. The general's scarred face contorted with remembered horror. It wasn't a communicator. It was a dead man's switch, connected to explosive charges that had been placed throughout the entire command complex. Minho had turned himself into a living bomb, and we had walked directly into his trap. Korthfel stood abruptly, his massive frame trembling slightly with the force of the memory. The explosion brought down 3 levels of the mining complex. Minho died instantly, along with my entire assault team and 50 of our best officers, including my second-in-command, Colonel Jexstar, who had served with me for 20 years. The general walked back to the viewport, staring out at the stars as if seeking answers in their distant light. But that wasn't the end of Minho's final lesson. As the complex collapsed around us, emergency systems throughout the colony activated, systems that he had programmed before our confrontation. Every remaining weapons cache, every hidden explosive, every booby trap that his people had prepared over months of resistance warfare, all of it triggered simultaneously. His voice grew very quiet, filled with a kind of awed respect. The explosions lit up the planet's surface like a second dawn. Minho had turned his own death into a signal, a final command that unleashed everything his people had been holding in reserve. He didn't just kill himself to take us with him, he transformed his sacrifice into a weapon that crippled our remaining forces and made holding New Busan impossible. Korthfel turned back toward the interviewer, his yellow eyes reflecting the weight of hard-won wisdom. That's when I truly understood what we were fighting. The humans don't just wage war, they become the war itself. Every one of them is willing to sacrifice everything. Not for victory in any conventional sense, but to make victory meaningless for their enemies. They turn their own deaths into weapons, their defeats into victories, their losses into lessons. For the survivors, the general's massive frame seemed to sag under the weight of the revelation. Minho taught me that conquering humanity isn't just difficult, it's impossible. Because even when you win, even when you kill them all, they find a way to make that victory cost more than any sane species would be willing to pay. The holographic display flickered to life, casting blue light across General Korthel's scarred features as he manipulated the controls with trembling claws. The 3-dimensional star map showed the Sol system in perfect detail, a yellow star surrounded by 9 worlds, one of which glowed with the distinctive blue-green hue that had become infamous throughout the galaxy. After the disaster at New Busan, the High Command was done playing games, Korthfel began, his voice carrying the weight of terrible decisions. The human resistance had cost us too much ships, soldiers, resources, and worst of all, reputation. Word was spreading through the outer colonies that the mighty Vrextai Empire could be defeated by a handful of miners with improvised weapons. He stood and walked closer to the hologram, his massive frame dwarfing the tiny representation of Earth. The Galactic Council was watching. Our enemies were taking notes. Every day we spent fighting humans was another day that our grip on the galaxy grew weaker. The High Command decided that humanity needed to be crushed so completely that no other species would ever dare to resist us again. Jixara watched as the general's claws traced the orbital paths around the Sol system, his movements precise despite the emotion in his voice. They assembled the Grand Fleet, 2 million vessels drawn. From every corner of the Empire, battleships that could crack moons, carriers loaded with enough fighters to blot out stars, dreadnoughts carrying weapons that could sterilize entire continents from orbit. The hologram expanded, showing the massive Vrextai fleet approaching. From the edge of the system like a swarm of metallic locusts. I commanded the 3rd Attack Wing personally, 50,000 ships, each one more powerful than anything humanity had ever built. We were just one small part of an armada so vast that it took 3 hours for the entire formation to pass through. A single jump point. Korthvel's scarred face twisted with remembered arrogance. Our intelligence estimates said the humans had maybe 10,000 ships defending their homeworld. Converted cargo haulers, mining vessels with welded-on weapons, civilian transports pressed into military service. We outnumbered them 200 to 1. Victory wasn't just certain, it was mathematically inevitable. The general manipulated the display, showing the human defensive positions scattered throughout the system. Their fleet commander was a human, female named Admiral So Young. Our files on her were even thinner than Colonel Haywan's had been. Career logistics officer, spent most of her service managing supply lines and transport schedules. No tactical training, no combat experience. No reason to take her seriously. He paused, his yellow eyes reflecting the holographic light. When the Grand Fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system, standard protocol called for us to demand immediate surrender. Give the humans one last chance to avoid total annihilation. The High Command expected them to capitulate immediately. When they saw the size of our armada, Korthvel's laugh was like grinding stone. Admiral Soyoung's response became legend throughout the galaxy. She broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring every ship in both fleets could hear her message clearly. The general's voice dropped to a whisper as he quoted words that had haunted him for years. Welcome to Earth. Population: 8 billion humans who refuse to kneel. You've come a long way to die today, but we'll make sure you don't leave disappointed. Chixara found herself leaning forward, completely absorbed in the tale. What happened next? Something that defied every rule of space warfare ever written, Korthvel replied, manipulating the hologram to show the opening moves of the battle. Instead of massing her forces for a defensive stand around Earth, Admiral Soyoung did the impossible. She scattered her entire fleet throughout the solar system. The display showed human ships spreading out in all directions, disappearing behind planets, diving into asteroid fields, even skimming the edge of the sun's corona. At first we thought she had panicked, that the sight of our armada had broken her nerve and caused her to flee in random directions. Our tacticians were already calculating how long it would take to hunt down the scattered remnants. The general's expression grew more animated as he relived the tactical puzzle that had confounded the Empire's finest military minds. But then the attacks began. Human ships emerged from hiding places we didn't even know existed, struck at our formations with precision that seemed impossible, then vanished back into the cosmic maze they had created. He highlighted specific areas of the display, showing attack vectors that curved around gravitational fields and used celestial bodies as cover. They had turned their entire solar system into a weapon. Ships hiding in the asteroid belt would use the rocks as shields while they launched missiles at our formations. Others concealed themselves in the rings of Saturn, emerging without warning to strike at our flanks before disappearing back into the ice and debris. Korthvel's voice took on an almost admiring tone. But the most audacious tactic came from ships that were actually using the sun itself as cover. They would dive into the corona, protected by experimental shielding that barely kept them from being incinerated, then ride the solar wind like a slingshot to achieve impossible velocities for their attack runs. The hologram showed the intricate dance of ships throughout the system, human vessels appearing and disappearing like ghosts in a three-dimensional maze that stretched across billions of kilometers. Admiral Soyoung had done something no military academy in the galaxy teaches. She had refused to fight the battle we wanted to fight. Instead, she forced us to fight on her terms, in her territory, using tactics that our computers couldn't predict or counter. The general paused the display, freezing the hologram at the moment when the battle reached its climax. For 6 hours, the Grand Fleet tried to adapt to this new form of warfare. Our formations were built for massive fleet engagements, ship-to-ship combat, where superior numbers and firepower would decide the outcome. But the humans refused to give us that battle. Korthvel's scarred hands clenched as he remembered the frustration of commanding a massive force that couldn't bring its strength to bear. Every time we moved to engage a group of human ships, they would scatter like leaves in a hurricane, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. They were treating space itself like the tunnel networks of New Busan, three-dimensional battlefield where knowledge of the terrain was more valuable than raw military power. The hologram resumed its motion, showing the crucial moment when everything changed. The real masterstroke came from a human captain named Dongwu, commanding a small frigate called the Soul's Vengeance. While our attention was focused on the hit-and-run attacks throughout the system, he'd been plotting something that no sane military commander would ever attempt. The display tracked a single human ship as it moved through the outer system, apparently fleeing from the battle. Captain Dongwu had been studying our formation patterns, identifying the exact location of our command flagship, the Asterisk Eternal, Dominion Asterisk, a dreadnought so massive that it carried its own escort fleet and served as the nerve center for the entire Grand Fleet. Korthvel's voice grew quieter, filled with a mixture of horror and respect. Using the gravitational field of Jupiter as a slingshot, Dongwu accelerated his frigate to nearly 15% of light speed, fast enough that our defensive systems couldn't track him, fast enough that collision avoidance protocols didn't have time to react. The hologram showed the soul's vengeance on its final approach. A tiny speck of metal and determination hurtling toward the heart of the Vrextai fleet. The impact lasted less than a microsecond. Captain Dongwu and his crew of 300 were vaporized instantly when their ship struck the Eternal Dominion's reactor core. But that microsecond changed the course of galactic history. The display erupted in brilliant light as the flagship's destruction created a chain reaction that rippled through the tightly packed Vrextai formation. The explosion took out not just our command ship, but 17 other vessels that were caught in the blast radius. More importantly, it severed the communication links that held our massive fleet together, turning an organized armada into a collection of confused, leaderless squadrons. Korthval deactivated the hologram and turned back toward the interviewer, his expression haunted by the memory of absolute defeat snatched from the jaws of certain victory. Admiral Soyoung had been waiting for exactly that moment. The instant our command structure collapsed, every human ship in the system converged on Earth for a final defensive stand. But they weren't retreating, they were consolidating for a counterattack. The general's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Without central coordination, our ships began making individual decisions, breaking formation to pursue targets or falling back to regroup. The humans struck at these isolated units with concentrated force, using their intimate knowledge of the system's geography to achieve local superiority. Despite being vastly outnumbered overall, he walked back to the viewport, staring out at the stars as if seeking answers in their distant light. The battle lasted 3 more days. But the outcome was decided in that single moment when Captain Dongwu turned his ship into a guided missile. The Grand Fleet, the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, was defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by humans who refused to fight the war we expected them to fight. Korthval's reflection in the reinforced glass looked older, marked by the weight of impossible defeat. When the survivors of the Grand Fleet limped back to Vrextai space, we brought with us something more valuable and more terrifying than any military intelligence: the knowledge that humanity couldn't be conquered through conventional means. They would always find a way to turn our strength against us, to transform our advantages into weaknesses, to make victory itself meaningless. The general's massive frame seemed to shrink under the weight of revelation. Captain Dongwu and Admiral Soyoung taught the galaxy something that no military academy had ever considered: that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning the battle you're expected to fight, but from forcing your enemy to fight a battle they can never win. The silence in the interview room stretched like the void between stars, heavy with the weight of unfinished stories and unspeakable truths. General Korthval sat motionless in his chair, his massive frame seeming smaller somehow, as if the telling of his tale had drained something vital from his core. Chixara waited, knowing that this final chapter would be the most important, the moment when everything changed, when the galaxy itself shifted on its axis and found a new balance. The recording device continued its quiet hum, capturing what would become the most significant testimony in galactic history. The war officially ended 6 months after the Sol System battle, Korthval began, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had seen too much. But the real ending, the moment that truly mattered, had nothing to do with treaties or surrender ceremonies or diplomatic negotiations in sterile conference rooms. He stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, like an old warrior whose body had been broken too many times to count. Walking to the far wall, he stopped before a display case filled with medals, commendations, and honors that gleamed under the artificial lights, a lifetime of military achievement that now felt as empty as the space between galaxies. The High Command was in chaos after the Grand Fleet's defeat. He continued, his scarred hands tracing the outline of a particularly ornate decoration. 2 million ships reduced to scattered remnants, fleeing through hyperspace with their tails between their legs, it's the largest military force in galactic history, destroyed not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by humans who refused to fight the war we wanted them to fight. Korthvela's yellow eyes reflected the metal's cold gleam. But the Empire wasn't finished. Pride, you understand? It's a terrible thing. The High Command couldn't accept that they had been outmaneuvered by what they still saw as primitive apes, who had barely learned to walk among the stars. They ordered one final campaign, a ground assault on the human colony of New Sol. Thinking that perhaps space warfare was simply not their strong suit, the general turned away from his decorations. Facing the interviewer with an expression that mixed regret with something approaching reverence, I was given command of the operation. 50,000 elite troops, the best the Empire had left, supported by orbital bombardment platforms and atmospheric fighters. Our target was a mining colony with maybe 20,000 inhabitants, most of them civilians who had never held a weapon in their lives. He began pacing again, but slower now, more thoughtfully. The intelligence reports made it sound routine. A small settlement built around rare earth mining operations, defended by a handful of local militia with outdated equipment. The kind of operation we had executed successfully 1,000 times on 1,000 different worlds. Chixara noticed how the general's movements had changed throughout the interview. From the aggressive pacing of a caged predator to the careful steps of someone carrying the weight of the universe on his shoulders. What made this engagement different? Their commander, Korthvel, replied immediately. A human named Lieutenant Jaehyun, barely 25 years old by their standards, fresh out of their military academy, with no combat experience and no right to be standing against the might of the Vrextai Empire. Our psychological profiles suggested he would break under pressure, that facing overwhelming odds would shatter his nerve and force a quick surrender. The general's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. He surrounded the colony with overwhelming force, set up bombardment positions that could reduce the settlement to rubble within minutes, and demanded their immediate surrender. Standard procedure: give the defenders one chance to save lives before we demonstrated the futility of resistance. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating tension like a coiled spring. Lieutenant Jaehyun's response was to walk out of the colony's main gate alone, carrying a white flag and wearing nothing but his standard uniform. No weapons, no armor, no protection, except the ancient laws of war that supposedly guaranteed the safety of those who approached under a flag of truce. Korthvel's voice grew quieter, more introspective. I met him halfway between our lines, expecting to negotiate terms of surrender, to accept the colony's capitulation and add another easy victory to the Empire's record. This young human looked so small, standing there in the shadow of my war machine, so fragile and insignificant that I almost felt sorry for him. The general touched one of the deeper scars on his face, a jagged line that ran from his temple to his jaw. But when Jaehyun looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Not fear, not desperation, not the defeated resignation I had seen in 1,000 conquered species. He looked at me with the calm certainty of someone who already knew how this story would end. Chixara found herself holding her breath, sensing that they had reached the crucial moment. The revelation that would explain how the mighty Vrextai Empire had simply ... stopped. Instead of offering surrender terms, Jaehyun handed me a data pad. Korthvel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I expected it to contain colony population figures, infrastructure layouts, maybe a plea for mercy. What I found instead changed everything I thought I knew about warfare, about strategy, about the nature of conflict itself. The general walked back to his chair but didn't sit down, instead gripping the back of it with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the metal. The datapad contained complete technical specifications for every class of Vrextai warship, detailed analyses of our military doctrine and tactical preferences, comprehensive studies of our command structure and decision-making processes, and most terrifyingly, strategic plans for asymmetric warfare that would make conquering human worlds not just difficult, but impossible. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the space station's life support system seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was processing the implications of what had just been revealed. How did they obtain such detailed intelligence? Chixara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That's what I asked Jaehyun, Korthvel replied, his scarred face twisting with remembered shock. His response haunts me to this day. Said, "General, you've been teaching us how to kill you from the moment we first met. Every battle, every engagement, every tactical decision you've made has been a lesson in Vrextai warfare. While you saw us as primitive animals to be conquered, we saw you as teachers showing us exactly how to defeat the most powerful military force in the galaxy." The general's massive frame shuddered slightly, and he told me something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Sir, you can win this battle. You can destroy this colony, kill everyone here, add another victory to your record. But it won't matter. This information has already been transmitted to every human world, every ship, every military academy in our space. Even if you kill me, even if you glass this entire planet, somewhere out there humans are studying your methods and learning how to fight you better." Korthfell finally sat down, his chair groaning under the weight of his massive frame and the heavier burden of his memories. That's when I understood the true genius of human warfare. They weren't just fighting to win individual battles. They were fighting to learn, to adapt, to evolve. Every defeat taught them something new. Every loss made them stronger. Every death provided data that would save lives in future conflicts. The general's yellow eyes met Chixaros directly, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. Not just respect for a formidable enemy, but genuine fear of what humanity represented. Jahan looked me straight in the eye and said, "General, you made one fundamental error in judgment. You assumed this was a war about territory, about resources, about conquest. It isn't. This is a war about ideas. The idea that no force in the universe has the right to make another species kneel. The idea that freedom is worth any sacrifice. The idea that sometimes losing every battle is the only way to win the war." The interview room felt smaller now, as if the weight of the story was pressing in on them from all sides. I called off the attack, Korthfell. Said simply, ordered my forces to withdraw, left that little colony untouched, and began the long journey back to Vrextai space with the knowledge that we had lost something far more important than a war. We had lost the illusion that military might alone could guarantee victory against an enemy that refused to accept defeat. The general stood and walked to the viewport one final time, staring out at the stars that had once seemed like a map of conquest but now looked more like a reminder of limitations. The official ceasefire was signed 3 weeks later. The Vrextai Empire withdrew from all human territories, abandoned our plans for expansion in that sector of the galaxy, and began the long process of adapting to a universe where absolute power was no longer absolutely guaranteed. His reflection in the reinforced glass looked older, wiser, marked by the kind of wisdom that could only come from facing an impossible truth and learning to live with it. But the real change, the transformation that mattered, happened inside the minds of every Vrextai who had fought in the human wars. We learned that conquest wasn't just about having the biggest fleet or the most powerful weapons. It was about breaking an enemy's will to resist. And humans had proven that their will could not be broken. Korthfell turned back toward the interviewer for the last time, his expression carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Today, 3 years after the war's end, human ships patrol the galaxy as peacekeepers. Not because they won through superior firepower, but because they proved something that every species in the galaxy needed to hear: that resistance is possible, that freedom is achievable, that no empire is so powerful that it cannot be challenged by those who refuse to surrender. He began walking toward the door, his interview complete, his story told. The humans have a saying that I didn't understand during the war: from the ashes we rise. I thought it was just poetry, empty words meant to inspire courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Now I know better. It's not poetry, it's a promise. A promise that no matter how many times you knock humanity down, they will always find a way to stand back up, stronger than before. Korthfell paused at the threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway as he prepared to leave behind the memories he had carried for so long. The galaxy is safer now, not because the Vrextai Empire learned mercy, but because we learned fear. Fear of what humans become when you try to break them. Fear of what any species might become if they decide that freedom is worth dying for. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss, leaving only the quiet hum of the recording device and the weight of his words hanging in the air like the echo of distant thunder. Shikara sat alone in the interview room, staring at the empty chair where one of the galaxy's most decorated warriors had just confessed that the greatest military force in known space had been defeated not by weapons or tactics, but by an idea, the simple, terrifying, beautiful idea that some things are worth fighting for. No matter the cost. The stars outside the viewport continued their eternal dance. But somehow they seemed different now, not cold and distant, but warm with the promise that somewhere among them, humanity continued to rise from whatever ashes they encountered, die. Stronger and more determined than ever before. The END.